And live now here on C-SPAN 2 from the Center for the National Interest in Washington, D.C., a discussion about the upcoming elections in Israel and the impact the elections could have on relations with the U.S. You're watching live coverage on C-SPAN 2.
And nice people. Clean. Unbelievable. Right. Well, he was in Australia. I won't come to it. Very nice.
We're going to start in a few minutes, so if you need a last-minute sushi or anything, now's the time to get it.
Nothing like a last-minute sushi.
Swallow it whole. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you so much for turning out. I think the size of the turnout suggests two things. One, the importance of the topic, and two, the importance of the speaker, who I think many of us have known for many years and who is clearly one of the most articulate and balanced, in my judgment, experts on Israeli politics in the widest sense of the word. Just for your edification, we are being shown on C-SPAN, and I'm not quite sure whether it's going out live, but it'll be published, it'll be broadcast sometime today. So what that means is that when you ask a question, please wait for the microphone to come to you and to give your name and affiliation so that the world can see who's talking. So listen, I'm not going to spend any long time introducing Shai. He's the director of the Crown Center at Brandeis University and professor of political science. I've known him for years. Before Brandeis, he was the head of the Jaffe Center, as it was then called, at Tel Aviv University. He was educated at Stanford and has been around the Israeli and American circuit for many, many years. And he and I have overlapped on many occasions, which go a long time back. So why are we here? I mean, first, the obvious point is that Netanyahu is the longest-serving Israeli prime minister. He's very close to President Trump and Jared Kushner, and if anything is going to happen on the peace front with this administration, then the Netanyahu-Trump team is clearly very important. They're also interested, as you know, in forging a closer relationship with the key Arab Gulf countries, particularly Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, primarily because of a country called Iran, which for both the Netanyahu government and the Trump administration clearly is the big enchilada in the Middle East and around who all evil lurks. There is, as we speak, something of an ongoing war underway between Syria, in southern Syria, involving Israel and Iran, that doesn't get talked about a lot, but is clearly very important. But the final point I'd make before I turn over to Shai is that from my reading of the situation, if you think our politics are divisive and divided right now, go to Israel, and you will find a parallel universe. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn over to Shai. I'm going to let him 25 minutes to make his presentation. He's got a handout which he will talk about. Then we will be open to Q&A, and since it's the Middle East, I'm certain he'll be prepared to entertain questions that go beyond the election. Shai, it's a great pleasure to welcome you back to the center, and thank you for making time to do it.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for having me, and thank you all for coming. You didn't mention the third motivation, which is the sushi out there. I'm going to talk a little bit about the handout. So those of you who haven't picked a copy up can just glance at your neighbor's handout. And so I'm going to focus on making 6 or 7 points about the elections that are coming on April 9. And you can take the conversation wherever you'd like to. After the points that focus on the elections. So I think I'll make 6 or 7 points. Number one is, and this will be a little bit embarrassing because there are a few people, they just happen to be on my right and my left, who could have given the talk instead of me. So especially on the first point, which is essentially Israeli Politics 101, is to understand that in Israeli elections, how the different parties fare is less important than the at least theoretical, if not practical, blocks to which these parties belong. And the reason is, and that has to do with the way essentially the way the process is structured in Israel, is that you have the elections. The election commission then confirms the results of the elections, says essentially how many members of Knesset each party got as a consequence of the vote. Okay. Then the next step is the role of the president of the country. Otherwise, only ceremonial. This is the most important role that the president of the country has, which is immediately after the elections commission authorizes confirms the results of the elections, the president calls to the president's mansion the representatives of all the parties that will have representation in the next Knesset, and asks each of the leaders of these parties or representative of these parties, who do they think, who will they support as the next prime minister, okay? And this allows the president to figure out what the next governing coalition, most likely coalition, would look like. Now, this doesn't require the person that he will understand as a result of these conversations has the best chance of forming the next government is not necessarily the leader of a party that got even a plurality. Okay, we've had elections in which Tzipi Livni party got one more than Likud, but failed to form a government. The president assigned Netanyahu, and in fact Netanyahu was able to form a government. So this is why the issue is what block of parties can essentially master a majority in the Knesset. Okay, so now here's where the polls can be highly, highly misleading, and the reason is that you've got all these small parties running. Okay, now the standard error in most of the polls is 3.5%. That actually happens to correspond with the yield, with the threshold. So parties that don't make the threshold, which is 3.5%, will not have a representation. Now, the problem, of course, here is that parties that fail the threshold, all the votes that went to these parties have essentially been wasted. So the question, sometimes the difference between what looks like difference in the polls or the results of the polls is simply because parties that are like hanging around the threshold, if they seem to be passing the threshold, well, then they would have 4 seats. Okay? So if they don't, then they don't have 3 seats, they have 0. Okay? So these fluctuations in the small parties, expected performance in the actual vote, accounts actually for the variance in these polls that we see. Okay, so this is basically 101. That's the first point. Okay, the second, by the way, since parties usually get slightly more than let's say the number of votes per members of Knesset, they usually have some surpluses. Then they enter into agreements among themselves about how to share these surpluses. Okay, these surpluses are not wasted, in contrast to parties that simply didn't make the threshold. The votes for parties, as I mentioned again, I will emphasize again, that didn't make the thresholds, those votes are completely wasted. Okay, so that's all you need to know about this point. Okay. Secondly, if you actually take a glance at this handout, you will see that if you look at the way these blocks are now forming, and you'll see one of them represents, the top one represents a poll that was taken between the 3rd and the 5th of this month, and the second one on page 2 is done by the same pollsters between the 5th and the 12th of this month. Well, what you'll see is that actually there's been very, very little difference. Now, again, some parties that didn't make the threshold in the first one made the threshold on the second one, and so you'll see some variance here. But in terms of the balance between the blocks, it's almost the same. So now I will qualify this point in terms of what does it mean to belong to a block. But if you just look at the graphics of these two, you see that for now at least there is very little change in this election campaign. That's actually almost English in the sense that it's the first time that it's only a 6-week story. So that's point number 2. Point number 3 is that is the difference between the right-wing bloc and what looks like, or the center-right and right-wing bloc on the one side, and the center-left and left-wing bloc on the other side. The difference is that you can have a situation in which the center-left and left would actually end up having more than 61 members of Knesset out of the 120. In other words, they might have a majority. That doesn't mean that they would have a governing coalition. What it means is that they will have a veto coalition, which is to say, they can vote if Netanyahu doesn't have a majority, forms a government, say, that has the support of 58 members of Knesset, okay, then the veto coalition of the center, left, and left can vote no confidence in the Knesset, in the parliament, in the same way that votes of confidence, no confidence in the British parliament go. And that right wing, therefore, will have huge difficulties in governing because it will be facing no confidence votes by the veto bloc, which is the center, left, and left. However, the center, left, and left, in a situation in which it has a majority of members of Knesset, doesn't have a governing coalition. Now, the reason it doesn't have a governing coalition is because it rests on, it has a majority because it rests on the support of a number of Arab parties that are somewhere between non-Zionists and anti-Zionists, okay? And you already have a statement made by the leader of the challenger to Netanyahu, which is General Gantz, heading the blue-white coalition, that said that said any party that is Zionist and Jewish is a coalition partner, is a potential coalition partner, okay? Which means that he has excluded the potential membership of Arab parties in a governing coalition. So that's the point to take. That's the takeaway point, which is you may have a situation in which one of the sides of the aisle numerically has a majority. That majority can actually help it become a veto coalition against the center, right, and right. It doesn't mean that it has a governing coalition. So that's point number 3. Point number 4 about these elections is, what are these elections about? It's far from clear what these elections are about. The only thing that actually unifies all the parties that seem to be to the left in this graph, the only thing that unifies them is opposition to Netanyahu, personally. Okay? So if you look at blue-white, which is this new party created by the 3 generals, General Gantz, General Bogi Ya'alon, General Ashkenazi, and of course the other partner, Yair Lapid. So just imagine that you would hear that another party is now brewing in this country towards the 2020 elections, and General Kelly and General McMaster and General Mattis decided to challenge President Trump. So this is the same problem, you see, because these guys have served President Trump. These guys in the Israeli side have served Prime Minister Netanyahu. In both cases, these are 3 generals who have spent hours and hours and hours and hours in your case, in the Oval Office or the Situation Room. In Israel's case, in meetings of the Security Cabinet. Okay? They know each other intimately. They've worked with one another. Okay? And one day they made this realization that the continued tenure of Netanyahu is a bad idea. Okay? And literally, it's very difficult to characterize what exactly differs them from Likud right now. Now, why is it the case? It's the case because the working assumption of this most important component of the center and center left opposition, their working assumption is that there is no support, valid support in the Israeli public today to challenge Likud in the name of peace negotiations with the Arab countries or with the Palestinians, based on a 2-state solution. Okay, their assessment is that there is insufficient support in the center of the map for a 2-state solution. Not that they think that that there has been a change in ideological predispositions. Do they think that there has been a turn to the right in the sense that people are now adopting the basic ideological predispositions of the right? No, but their assumption is that there is a bulk of the electorate right now that believes that whatever you believe about the prospects of peace, it's irrelevant because there is no partner. Okay? And the reason why this no partner narrative is so prevalent in Israel today is because it wasn't invented by the right. Okay? It was invented by former Prime Minister Barak, then Prime Minister, and former Foreign Minister Shlomo Ben-Ami, leaders of Labor, who came out of the experience called the Camp David negotiations in 2000, saying, and then of course the Second Intifada, saying Israel has no partner. Okay? So it's the fact that this narrative has actually been concocted by the center left that now makes the situation, and now that you see explains why this fascinating poll that you'll see in the last handout. This is a very recent poll that says the following: you have 71% of the Jewish public in Israel thinks that there is a moral problem with Israel's control over the Palestinians. Now look at the second one. Using biblical terms, okay, 78% of Israeli Jews think that control over the Palestinians in Judea and Samaria is not good for Israel. So you ask, if you have such a solid majority that says that the continued control over the Palestinians is a moral problem, and so on and so forth, and that it's not good for Israel, well then, why aren't they voting? Why would not they support parties that challenge the status quo? And the answer is in the fourth paragraph. The majority of the public, 66%, think that there is no alternative at present. So what you have is not a change in ideology. You have essentially a situation in which belief in the feasibility or viability of a two-state solution has declined dramatically. The result is that you have one bloc led by Likud, which is now running against the two-state solution, and the other bloc led by blue-white that tries to hide a two-state solution. Probably what are the mountains in Colorado where you have NORAD and, very well fortified, and so on and so forth, so can stand the nuclear attack. Okay, so there, the center and center left are basically now. This goes to such an extreme that General Gantz met recently, that is to say recently in Israeli this election cycle is really a few days ago, with ambassadors of the European Union, and to the ambassadors of the European Union, he refused to say that he supports a two-state solution. And the party platform that was made public Wednesday, 10 days ago, says that to preserve a Jewish state, Israel should separate itself from the Palestinians, but it shouldn't disengage. Are you going to Google what this means? Okay. Now, if you will, you find the answer. I'll be happy to. I'll be happy to have it. But what is this based on? It's based on essentially a reading of the political map that says, as I said, that there is not sufficient support of a two-state solution. It also means something about the leadership of the challenge to Netanyahu, which is they're not leading, actually. They are reading public opinion polls. They assess maybe correctly where the public is, and they craft their positions along this reading. Okay, so that's point number, I think, 4. 5 is if you look at these graphs, and you see that the two blocks are relatively equal in size. In one case, it's 59-61. In one case, it's 59.5, 60.5, and so on. They look okay. There's something very misleading here. And the reason, and what is misleading here are two things. Number one, in the blue-white coalition, there is a faction that just as well could have been on the right. Okay, and that faction is the faction that's led by the former defense minister Ya'alon, former head of the chief of staff. This is a right-wing faction within this coalition, and now part of it is Ya'alon himself belongs to this category that I mentioned earlier. He's not against the two-state solution, but he believes that there's no leadership on the other side that is a potential partner for concluding a two-state solution agreement with and implementing a two-state solution. But within that faction, there are actually other people who are ideologically against the two-state solution. The clearest example of that is a former journalist. He was a journalist until 2 weeks ago, Yoaz Hendel, who is a thinker, a very articulate thinker, and he's clearly on the right. So the first point about this division that looks like equal, it's not equal. Okay, and we'll get to that in the importance of this in the last point that I'll make. Okay, that's the first reason. The second reason is that basically these polls represent responses to a simple question, which is, if elections were held today, who would you vote for? But a recent poll did an interesting follow-up. And the follow-up was, after the first question was asked, which provides these distributions, the second question was, how certain are you that you're going to vote for your preference? 70% of those who expressed preference for Likud and said, if the elections were held today, I would vote for Likud, 70% of them said, I am certain I will vote for Likud. For those who said, I will vote for the blue-white coalition, only 28% said that they are certain. Okay? That means that you should never, ever, ever look only at the distribution of opinion. You should also look for indices of intensity with which views are held. And this is a major source of asymmetry here. Okay, the sixth point I would make is that in Israel's case, the story doesn't end because of all these reasons on April 9. It only begins in April 9. So that actually involves two points, the sixth and the seventh. The sixth is, because of everything that I said, it's not clear what is actually going to hold the blue-white coalition together after April 9, because in fact, they don't seem to be in agreement on any particular line. They don't have a clear policy with respect to what to do with the Palestinians. They certainly don't have an economic and social policy, except uttering the normal words about needing to, equality and reduce the gap between the periphery and the center, and all these things, but nothing that amounts to an economic program. So it's not clear, whether this coalition will survive. I mean, Israel has a history since the aftermath of the 73 war of center parties that are one electoral cycle long. Okay, some survived a couple of electoral cycles, but as I said, it's not clear whether blue-white, in my view, will survive after that. And the last point is, well, at least there is increasing indications that the Trump administration will finally come out with their so-called ultimate deal. They said sometime after the April Israeli elections. Well, then what happens? So you have two questions that create, let's say, huge question marks about what exactly will be decided on April 9. Now, why do I say this? First of all, the first thing that's going to come up, assuming that they will do what they say they will do, which is to come out with this initiative sometime, say, in May or June, then the question is the Israeli reaction to a Trump proposal, will it reflect this distribution? And I say, right now, that doesn't look like it, because, as I said, right now, within blue-white, you have at least one faction that is going to utter a very strong negative reaction. It doesn't believe in prospects for a deal at all. So the first question is, if this comes up in May or in June, how would the Israeli reaction to this reflect the results of the April 9 elections? The second is, what happens if Netanyahu is finally actually indicted? Now, the situation right now is that the Attorney General said, subject to a final hearing that I will give the Prime Minister in July, okay? He said in July, I will make a final determination, and it's unlikely after he's gone so far that even if there will be a hearing, that there won't actually be an indictment. Now the question is, two questions. One is, if everything to the left side of this graph is simply unified by opposition to Bibi, well, what happens if Bibi disappears? Okay? Now, Bibi can disappear not because legally he's bound to leave office if indicted, because actually he's not. And certainly some circles within his Likud party will say until proven guilty, he should be seen as innocent. But politically, that's not going to be a viable position. And believe me, the day after an indictment, there'll be people within Likud that are going to call for his replacement. So then what happens? In a situation where the only glue that right now looks like holding these different parties together, those on the other side, on the left side, it's not clear what's going to hold them together then. So what we say is that come May, June, July, we're almost bound now to have two important events that are going to pose real question marks about the meaning of whatever results we will see, say in April 11 or 12, when the results of the vote will be clear. I think I'll stop here.
Okay, well, a lot to digest, and I see all sorts of experts around the table, so I will start to make a list, but I see you, Bob.
By the way, I should add only one last point in terms of the political viability of what happens after he's indicted. It's very interesting also. If you look at all the polls and you ask who's more fit to be prime minister, General Gantz or Netanyahu, as I said, even on that question, the numbers vary, but they're mostly even. Then 60% of the Israeli public, when asked, do you think that Netanyahu should continue even if indicted? 60% of the Israeli public now says no. If he's indicted, he has to go.
While I'm just trying to decipher my own list, just say a few words about the third factor that could happen between April and July, namely the fighting in Syria gets worse. The shelling across the Gaza border gets worse. How does that affect thinking?
I actually don't think it affects at all. I mean, look at what's happening now because of the escalation in Gaza. You have two kind of ridiculous challenges or attacks. General Gantz said they will restore deterrence. How will they restore deterrence? He said, well, we will bring back the policy of targeted killings, which were administered during the Second Intifada. Within Likud, Miri Regev is attacking these guys which is kind of following, but in a more extreme sense, Netanyahu's line, which is that blue-white is a leftist party. So now we have a party that's led by 3 generals and a deputy director of the Mossad who are now being accused of being a leftist party. Now, I'm sure that if this wasn't, anyway, the C-SPAN is on, so I won't say what but here's why this is ridiculous and why this is also answers your question. Because these people have, together with Netanyahu, crafted the Israeli policy versus Gaza for the last 10 years. And these people, all of these generals, were party to the policy adopted by the Israeli government regarding the Syrian front. Okay? And hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours they discussed these issues, and actually discussed them seriously. And I give them credit for having discussed both of these sets of issues seriously. The problem is not whether, first of all, so the results on April 9 are not going to affect how Israel would react to the Syrian challenge. Whatever combination of these individuals is not going to make a difference, because they're the ones who crafted the Israeli policy over the last decade. And the same thing applies to the issue of Gaza. The problem with both camps, with respect to Gaza, if there are camps here, is that what really unifies them is the lack of courage on all of them part to tell the Israeli public the truth. And the truth is that there is no simple solution to this problem. And everybody now forgets the hours and hours of deliberations and how they weighed all these pros and cons with regard to every policy option, because now everybody is in election mode. And in election mode, you have to produce very simple formulas and hope that they will catch. But everybody knows. Everybody knows. And the thing is that the Israeli public is, in that sense, smarter than its leaders. The Israeli public knows that there is no simple solution. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't understand the Israelis who live in the south that genuinely need a solution to their daily problem, to the predicaments of their daily life, because there is no solution to the problem of Gaza. Luckily, there is no similar concentration of population, along the Syrian border right now, and there's not a similar challenge. But you can easily understand why the people who live where they live are asking for a solution to their safety and security problem. But the Israeli public at large, they understand that there is no simple solution to this. So this kind of production of these catchy, one phrase and so on and so forth, will restore deterrence, will do this and so on and so forth. We've heard, Israelis have heard this time and time again, and they know it's not serious.
Okay, I just want to make sure I've got down everyone's name, but you still need to repeat it when the microphone comes to you. Dov, Amitai, Ted, the gentleman at the back, Gil, Stephen, O'Day. Am I missing anyone from this list? Okay.
Okay, Dov Zakheim, I'm vice chairman of this place. I'll do it again. Dov Zakheim, I'm still vice chairman of this place. Excellent presentation, as always, Shai. A couple of questions. The first is, the Palestinians have already said that any such proposal is dead on arrival. And King Salman of Saudi Arabia has said if the Palestinians aren't happy, he's not going to be happy. Which means that whatever Jared Kushner comes up with is going nowhere. Doesn't that sort of take the whole Palestinian issue off the political table, since every leader of the parties that you mentioned can say, well, there's nothing now. So that's question number one. Question number two is, I wonder if you overlooked one thing that I've seen over the years in Israel, and there are quite a few other people who can correct me. Israeli politicians love being ministers more than anything else. They like all the perks. They like everything about being a minister. So the question, therefore, is, if you look at these charts, Kulanu, Mr. Kahlon, which way does he really go? And particularly if there's an indictment and some of the Likud people want Bibi to go, and Bibi's already said he's not going to go, and the blue and white folks offer ministries. Can you talk a little bit about that kind of a scenario?
Do you want me to take them one by one?
Yes, yes.
So the first one is really complicated. What does all this tell you about what's likely to happen if indeed the Trump administration comes out with an initiative? So it's very simple, in my view, which is, in my view, the challenge, and over the next, say, couple of weeks, there'll be a piece that I'm co-writing with my Palestinian colleague Khalil Shikaki, as always, so that you get the different perspectives on this. But I would say this: the challenge for the Trump team now is actually very, in a way, simple. It's complicated, but it's simple. The challenge is to come up with something that would not be so ridiculous, okay? And when I say so ridiculous, I mean so one-sided, okay? Which would be simply the continuation of the unilateral decisions that were made until now, like on Jerusalem, like on the consulate, like on the embassy, and so on and so forth. So if what they will finally come up with is simply a continuation of the present trajectory, then the Palestinians will have all the grounds to dismiss it completely out of hand, okay? So, but that means that 2.25 years of preparations will evaporate in 10 seconds. So the challenge for them is to, in my view, is to come up with something that is not so completely ridiculous. In other words, that the Palestinians will see enough in it to say, we don't like it, we've got 1 million reservations, but for the first time in 2 years, there is enough here that we're willing to engage the administration and engage the Israelis in a conversation about the deal and about its possible implementation. Now, you were right to make the connection, because the same thing applies to the Arab leaders that the administration is counting on, because the Arab leaders cannot press the Palestinians simply by using brute force, okay? If they try to do it, they try to do something with Prime Minister Hariri in Lebanon. It didn't end so well, okay? So it's not going to go that way, okay? They also have to anticipate that brute pressure on the Palestinians would end in them being depicted as having betrayed the Palestinian cause. So my assumption is that these guys have learned something. So again, if it's,
that's a very generous assumption.
and if it's not, then it's the end of the conversation, because as I said, the initiative would then last 5 seconds. Okay, it will be dismissed out of hand. The Saudis, the Emiratis, President Sisi, and King Abdullah will not have a case to Abbas, and we'll have fewer questions next time that Jeffrey invites me here. So that's my. Now, on the issue of Qur'an, look, there is, and again, that's. I of course didn't talk about this because we can talk for the next 2 weeks. I made the point that there is some misleading aspects in this division. The issue of Kulanu is in some ways goes in the opposite direction of what I said about Bogi Ya'alon's faction. Bogi Ya'alon can easily defect to the right. Kulanu can easily defect to the center and the center left. Now, here is another issue, which is, so that actually does pertain, again, if the Trump initiative will be one that will be dead on arrival, then forget about it. But if it won't be dead exactly on arrival, in other words, there will be something there that would cause the Israelis to have to think about what their position is about this, then I would say this, then there are some factions, and Kulanu is one of them, which will also be sensitive to the potential economic consequences of confronting Trump. Now, Israelis are following Trump carefully, okay? They also see that Trump has this peculiar capacity of bringing his wrath against traditional American allies, okay? Trudeau, Macron, Merkel, all these. And I think that even Netanyahu is not entirely, doesn't sleep. He has enough reasons not to sleep very well these days. But even now, you've got other specific factions that really care about the issue of U.S.-Israeli relations in terms of the effects on economy and finance. Kulanu, because he's very sensitive to the social economic Israeli middle class, and so any deterioration in Israel's economy, he cares a lot about. Then there are other factions that simply are more tied to funding by American Jews, okay? In both cases, the ultra-Orthodox Jewish parties and Shas as well, okay, have a lot of, so tension in U.S.-Israeli relations is something that scares them, okay? So you will get some fluidity there in both directions. Assessing now, whether these trajectories will not just cancel each other out, I think is impossible. And again, we may be saved from having to make this analysis if they'll come out with something that the Israelis won't even, before the Israelis even say anything about it, the Palestinians would just say, oh, come on, this is completely ridiculous. We're not even going to engage you.
Could you say that a little louder, please?
Amitai Etzioni, GW. You mentioned that there's no significant difference between the two camps on foreign policy and on socio-economic policy. Can you say something about the civil rights, religious stuff? Is there a significant difference in how that reflects in the electorate? Second and last, can you imagine a left coalition with support of the Palestinians without the Palestinians being in the government?
So the answer to the third question, if I understood it, is that I think I already said that my answer actually, I just formulated it differently, but I don't see it. I mean, what I said is that camp on the left side of the graphs, it has a veto coalition, but I don't see it having a governing coalition. And governing coalition means agreeing on, for example, what you just suggested. So for the moment, I don't see it. Now, I didn't say that there is no difference in foreign policy between the two camps, because I think that I understand where the central figures of blue-white, again, excluding the faction I talked about, but all the other characters, they're not in the same camp as Likud leaders, okay? Because there's a difference. There's still a difference between opposition to a two-state solution and a position that says we would love to have a two-state solution, but the conditions aren't there. We don't have the leadership with which to negotiate this, and so on and so forth. So I'm not saying, but what I am saying is that because they are crafting their election strategy on their reading of where the Israeli public is, you don't see in this campaign a discernible difference between the two. This is where we are right now. So I don't know if that answers.
My main question is about the Haredim. From what I hear, there is a strong feeling in large part of the Israeli public that this force.
Oh, right, on the civil rights. You're right. I think
that's a significant difference between Lapid and the right.
Yes, and it actually goes both ways, because right now Lapid is careful in what he's saying, but the Haredim the ultra-Orthodox are saying, we won't sit in a coalition with him. Okay? Of course, it actually is part of the explanation why, even if, that left part would have a plurality, it doesn't have a governing coalition. Okay? It just doesn't have a governing coalition if this stability in the polls that we see until now would manifest, would be reflected in the vote. But here I just want to again caution one thing, which is that just remember that if you have a situation where the second largest coalition, which is to say those who oppose Likud, where only, let's say, about 30% of the people that say we're going to vote for them are certain that they're going to vote for them, then, expect on April 9 lots of surprises.
Okay.
Ted Kattouf, president of Amities. You've talked about the fact that across the Israeli political spectrum, there's almost a consensus that we have no partner for peace, or at least it's convenient to say we have no partner for peace. The Palestinian Authority is about as weak as it's been since Oslo. The administration and Congress, without getting into all the details, have cut off funding. You can't deal with the PA in terms of funding. They have cut off funding for any USAID projects, which affects the Palestinians as a whole. UNRWA has been cut, affects employment, West Bank and Gaza. So the Palestinians are looking at, even by their relative standards, an economic depression. And the Palestinian Authority is isolated. After the election, do you think one or the other party might talk to the administration about changing some of this, particularly because of the security forces of the Palestinians help to protect Israel, along with protecting the PA? Or do you think it's the pressure on the right will be such that it will just collapse?
Well, what I would say is that in this sense, I also think that this is another dimension along which there is, I have to be careful here, some similarity between the situation in Israel and the situation in the US, which is to say, broadly speaking, a gap between the professional level and the political level. Okay? So if you ask me, do I see some kind of a constellation of the Israeli political level who would go to the Trump administration and say, this is too dangerous, then I would say at this point, maybe, if, again, if blue-white by some miracle forms the next government, or is a major party to the next government, then I could see some of them, I don't know publicly, but quietly, certainly, making that point. Now, at the professional level, this is already the case. Okay, at the professional level, in the Israeli spectrum, it's not a division of opinion among politicians. It's, again, between the political level and the professional level. For the professional level, this is already a nightmare. Okay? But this is exactly the point in which they understand, and here is a very tricky thing, you see, because look at what's happening in the last few days in Gaza. Okay, so many among the Israeli professional level have been arguing now for weeks, if not months, that if you create a situation in which the population in Gaza has no hope, then sooner rather than later there'll be another explosion. But don't forget that on the ideological right, at the political level, there are, again, the Israeli equivalents to their American friends who are thinking, how are they thinking about Iran? Their American friends. They're thinking about regime change. And now what you have is that the pressure in Gaza now has two effects. One is we see already the consequences of a population in despair. We've seen it along the border for, God, the last 8 months at least, every Friday. But now look at what's happening on the ground. The population in Gaza is also turning against Hamas. So surprise, surprise, that some of those who argue that the only solution is regime change are saying, but you see, why? What's the problem here? The problem is that the reason why the strategy, again, against those who said they have a solution to this problem, right? We have one of the parties running in this election is headed by Naftali Bennett, who says, I have a solution to the problem. Just make me Minister of Defense, and I'll solve the problem. You see? The problem is that what is troubling the professional community in Israel, it's not that necessarily the question of at what costs, what kind of casualties will be involved in an effort to unseat Hamas and so on and so forth. In the end of the day, this debate is settled by one issue, which is, okay, so what's your scenario of what the day after is going to look like? Who exactly is going to replace Hamas? Is there, and if you, this is exactly the difference. You see, the professional level are defense planners. If there is some common denominator, in my view, to defense planners all over the world, is that they don't know how to deal with chaos. Okay, they know how to. It's problematic enough to establish deterrence when you have an address. If you have 200 addresses, it's a nightmare. Okay. Now the question is, if somebody can come up with a brilliant idea as to how, after you go there and attack Hamas in the third set of tunnels that nobody's talking about, which is the set of tunnels at the heart of the Gaza Strip where they are bunkered, okay, and you kill them one by one, and you've eliminated the leadership of the military arm of Hamas, and so, okay, great. And then what? Who's going to take over Gaza? Okay, so there was a lot of wisdom to, Colin Powell's statement. Yes, in this case, this is a classical case of you break it, you own it. Okay, and there is no appetite. There's not a single leader in Likud that's actually proposing this.
From Lowblog, thank you for this presentation. It seems to me that most factors that could go either way are pushing a little bit more towards Likud. So if I'm with Kachol Lavan, I'm looking for some way to change the playing field more in my direction. And it also seems to me that the upcoming AIPAC policy conference, where both Netanyahu and Gantz are supposed to be speaking, provides an opportunity for that. So Gantz has already indicated that he and his party want to try and repair some of the relationships with the American Jewish community, with the Democratic Party that Netanyahu has hurt over the years. So I'm wondering what you think, how you think this could play out possibly in the election if Gantz is able to make a good case and offer some promise for restoring the bipartisanship around Israel and helping to mend the relationship between Israel and the American Jewish, mainstream American Jewish community.
So I have two parts to my answer to your question. One is I don't know. Okay. The second is to do what you're suggesting requires courage. Because there is a tension between what it takes, in their view, which is, say, those who you are referring to, which is blue, white, and so on, what they understand is required of them, given their reading of the Israeli political map that I described earlier, and rebuilding bridges to a Democratic Party that is also not where it was, say, 20 years ago. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, if the challenge is to bridge the gap with the growing gap between the American Jewish community and Israel, or Israel and the American Jewish community. And when I say growing, the reason I say growing is because the lower you go in the age cohort, the bigger the gap. Okay? So then you have to ask yourself, okay, so what's the basis of this gap? What is the driver that is now driving this increasing gap? Okay? It has nothing to do with all the issues we discussed until now. It has a little, it's not that it doesn't have anything to do. Yes, it's because the young generation in the American Democratic Party is more liberal and so on and so forth. So what Israel's position is vis-a-vis peace and the Palestinians is not insignificant, but I would say it's dwarfed by the gap between their support of religious pluralism and Israel that at least doesn't seem right now committed to this set of values of religious pluralism. So now for this, you need courage. You need to come out and say exactly how. If you are sensitive to the dangers that from Israel's point of view, for this growing gap between Israel and the U.S. because of a growing gap between Israel and the American Jewish community on these issues, then you have to have the courage to say exactly how are you going to fix this? What positions? How are you willing to change course in Israel to allow a reduction of this gap? But so far, I have to say, again, I go back to this. The problem with the strategy that has been adopted until now by those who are challenging Likud and challenging Netanyahu is that they look, the platform that was published 10 days ago, you can't find anything to disagree with about because it's, it doesn't say very much.
Gil. No. Gil.
Sorry. Hi, Jack. Thanks.
You're coming next.
Gil Barndollar, I'm here at the center. You've spoken about how, in practice, there's not going to be a dramatic difference in how Likud or Blue and White would govern. Given that if things break pretty well towards Blue and White and they're very close to having a governing coalition, do Gantz and Lapid have any ability to peel off one of the smaller right-wing parties and complete a governing majority? The kind of inducements they could offer, and is that a possibility?
Yeah. Again, I mean, first of all, I want to slightly correct you because I've already tried to make this correction. I'm not saying that there's no difference between the way they will govern. What I'm saying until now is because of the way that I'm now saying this for the third time, because of the particular way in which Blue-White reads the map, they are blurring instead of sharpening, the differences. So it's not that they wouldn't govern differently. It's that based on the way they're running the campaign, we can't tell that they would govern differently. That's the only point. Now, the answer to your question is yes, they can, and Kulanu is the best example that the Dov, they're the most ripe for moving in the other direction. But what I'm saying is that. Okay, you see, but here's the unpredictable. Okay, let me give you a scenario. Let's say the scenario is, let's say that Trump administration, despite all the reservations and assumptions that Dov made, which are obviously a little bit different from my assumptions about what this would look like, because, as I said, because it's the end of conversation if the initiative will come out the way that Dov thinks it will come out, although probability, I would say, is there's a higher probability that Dov is correct and I'm wrong, but, okay, let's say that they come out with an initiative that is at least seen as a subject of conversation, then, and this happens before there is an indictment, okay? So now Netanyahu is still prime minister. The Trump administration has come up with an initiative. Now I can say, well, this is a situation in which Netanyahu has the political option of saying, we accept the initiative as a basis of negotiations, okay? And he then has to give up, and he will be giving up by making the statement giving up the more extreme right parties, okay? He may even, so, but under those circumstances, even if the Ya'alon faction defects from blue-white, there can be enough support in blue-white to enter a coalition with him on this basis. Now, all this stuff about, oh, you know, we'll never sit in a coalition with Netanyahu, forget it, okay? The minute this comes out, they will say, U.S.-Israeli relations are at stake. Are we going to say no to the President of the United States that has proven over the first 2.5 years, he's given us down payments to prove his affection, his relation, his connection to Israel and so on? Are we going to risk this new relationship that we've established? And again, don't forget that you have a political strata there that's built their political career on anti-Obama. Okay? So now they've now saw Trump's behavior as confirming, you know, and it's not just Trump's statements and so on and so forth. It's Netanyahu can say, and on real basis, I have established a different relationship with the United States. This allowed it allowed me, Netanyahu, to have influences over this administration. It yielded real results. For example, for him, the most important is the American abandonment of the JCPOA. Okay? So the president, has proven his commitment to Israel's security over the one issue which I, Netanyahu, think is an existential threat. Now I say, maintaining the relationship with this president is more important than anything else. And trust me, there'll be enough people on the other side that will join him. So again, now to calculate all these trajectories and so, that's where it gets very murky.
Stephen Cook, Council on Foreign Relations. Let's assume for the moment that the Trump administration's deal this century is one of those things that the Israeli government doesn't have to say anything and the Palestinians will reject out of hand. You pointed out that there is a nuanced difference between Likud and blue and white. Likud is running against the two-state solution, and blue and white says, sure, we'd be supportive of a two-state solution if there was a partner.
One is running against it, the other one is running from it.
From it, exactly. Regardless of the outcome of the election, isn't essentially the outcome the same, however, right? If Likud wins, they already today, the leader of Knesset said, we will start discussing annexation. And running against it, given the structure of Israeli politics right now, where 66% of the people said there's no alternative, there's no partner for peace, there's no alternative to the status quo, don't you just have more of the same?
No.
Which means stalemate?
No.
Which means the continuation of the... No?
No.
Convince me that I'm wrong.
Because here's what you potentially are missing. Now, I would say this. Again, probably you're right.
I'll take that. You can stop there.
You will feel good, but the political outcome will be bad.
Yeah, of course.
So here's a scenario in which you may be wrong. And so let me give you this following scenario. So again, I think that right now, the reason why we see the leadership of blue-white taking their position has to do with only one thing, which is right now what's in their mind is only one thing: how to win the elections. Okay? Rightly or wrongly, the strategists that they are employing led them to conclude that keeping running away from stating that they're in favor of a two-state solution is the way to win the elections. Okay, now let's say, okay, we don't know what exactly the numbers will be after April 9, but let's assume that blue-white comes out of this with a significant showing, and you're basically saying, well, so what's the difference? Likud is against it, and they've run from it, and it would yield the same results. And I'm saying, no, it can yield very different results, because the day after the elections, the goal is no longer to win the elections. Now imagine that in this situation, President Sisi, King Abdullah of Jordan, the Emiratis and others come to the same set of generals and saying, here's what's at stake here, okay? Here's what's at stake here. This is along the lines of the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, 2007, but with a lot of, making this vivid and colorful and real in terms of what kind of new relationship Israel can have with the region if it responds differently. Then the right wing, the real right wing, will not buy this. But those who are at the center left, in my view, they will be very receptive to it. So there is play here, okay? There is play on only one assumption, okay? Again, that it will come to Israel having to articulate a position. If it's going to be a ridiculous initiative, then none of this would happen, okay? There are a set of circumstances that have to take place, or set of developments have to take place that would thresh out the differences between being against this and, for the moment, running from it. And I see a possibility of, now it will require some courage, some it would require being a little more proactive. In the case of President Sisi, is a very good example. He will have to engage slightly more than he has until now in educating his public, because right now it's completely bifocal, right? Security cooperation over the Sinai and all these other things, and letting the Egyptian parliament say whatever they want, and so on and so forth. Or even more ridiculous that I won't get into. So yeah, it would require some, but there's a difference between the two camps.
Okay, I have four more people, and that will be it. But over to you with the next.
Shai, thanks for an excellent clinical analysis of the Israeli situation. My question to you, how do young Israelis fit into this spectrum? Are they to the Likud side? Are they to the blue and white? Where do they stand?
I think that the data we have is that the sharpest decline in support for a two-state solution is among the younger generation. And I think that, and I haven't done the polling myself, because I would have liked to know, does this mean that there is a turn to the right among the young generation? And my hunch is that the answer is no, that the young generation is exactly where it's sharpest, that they don't believe that there is another option. They comprise the majority of these 66%. I mean, they're definitely, among them, it's 95%. And remember, the young generation has never seen a different reality. So it's, now, that's number one. Number two is, my impression is the young generation is also the most apolitical. Okay? They are the most disgusted with politics, and they're disgusted with politicians. So what you have, the same thing that you have in other countries, which is turnout among the young is not, what are they interested for? Look, here's the simple story is, if you are a 25-year-old Israeli, it's very, very simple, okay? I'll make it vivid for you, okay? And you take, the newspaper that Netanyahu sees as the enemy, just like Trump sees CNN as the enemy, right? Haaretz, okay? Now, if you're a young Israeli, 25 years old, in which section of the newspaper do you want to be? In the front section? Well, some sports, but I would say mostly you want to be in the economic section, okay? That's where the good news is. That's where the real story, as far as the young people are concerned, that's where the real story is, okay? If a company in Israel was sold last week for $7.6 billion to an American chip maker and so on. That's where these guys want to be. So on the contrast, when they see the news or they see the political talk shows, that's exactly where they don't want to be.
Okay, around. So the lady's gone, right hand is gone, gentleman there. Yep.
Andrew Steinfeld, former Foreign Service officer. Quick question, that very right-wing Israeli party that got so much publicity here in the United States when Bibi said he joined with them. Could you talk a little about that? I admit to not even knowing if they show up on this chart. And second question, I'm still a bit confused about the calculation vis-a-vis the Arab parties. If the president is looking at the results, does he include the Arab parties in a potential 61?
Yes.
He does. Okay.
Yes. But you see, this is, so I'll take the second question first. Yes, but you see, this is, again, it's one of the only instances where the president has some leeway, he has some discretion. He has to think also about what these coalitions might look like, because he's not going to entrust somebody with creating a government when he knows that that government will not be a governing coalition. And therefore, some people are actually talking about, that the results of April 9 will be such that there will be no choice but to have another election in 6 months' time. I don't know how they reach this exactly the conclusion, because you have to ascribe to these polls such a degree of confidence to be able to say, oh, we can discern from this that in fact the outcome will be that it's going to be a draw, essentially, and there will be no choice but to. And then on what basis do you expect that 6 months from now the results will be different? What will happen is if you have more 6 months kinds of elections, I tell you what will actually politically happen in Israel. There'll be a change in the distribution of power in favor of those who've been arguing for years and years and years that you have to change the electoral system. That will happen because why? Because what you see is that to a large extent, if you see that the results are so much affected by how political parties that master 3 to 4% can affect the balance, then you see that this is the purely proportional system for these people looks ridiculous. So that you will have, but that's as far as it goes. Now, what was your first?
About that right-wing party. Right-wing.
Yeah, look, there are a number of worrisome right-wing parties, but what is going on now is essentially the party. What happened that made Netanyahu's intervention here look so unacceptable is that basically he created a situation in which he intervened, he got involved in making his preference clear that he wanted a party that is comprised of the disciples of Rabbi Kahana to actually, the end result would be have a representation in the Knesset. Now, again, it's not that Netanyahu, I don't believe for a second that Netanyahu associates himself with what drives these really, real extremists, okay? But again, for him, why did he get involved here? Because there are a number of tiny factions. Each of them was likely to get less than 3.5%, which means that right-wing voters that would have voted for these little tiny right-wing extremist factions, these votes would have just been wasted, exactly as I said in my opening remarks. So what he tried to do is create a situation in which they will coalesce and therefore together get past the threshold, so that the right wing now as a bloc, all these on the other side, will not lose these tens of thousands of voters, but they will be expressed and so on and so forth. Now, of course, the reaction, the clear reaction, and that also ties to the issue of the reaction not only within Israel but also here, about well, wait a minute, are there no principles?
David, you were the last one.
Yeah,
Thanks very much. I'm Dave Pollack from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. First, I just want to quickly comment on one brand new factor that just happened yesterday, which is that the Israeli Supreme Court, while disqualifying an extremist Jewish candidate, reversed the decision of the Election Commission and will allow the more radical of the two major Arab political blocs, party blocs, to run in the election after all. Ironically, in my view, the net effect of that is actually to increase slightly the chances that the right wing will win the election, because more Arab voters will turn out. More of them will probably vote for Arab parties rather than left-wing or centrist Israeli parties, and as a result, the right wing will probably have more margin for maneuver after the election. That's so it's a win for democracy in a certain sense, but at the same time, I think probably a win for the right wing and for Netanyahu in another sense. Strange but true. Now my question. You said that you think that after the July hearing on Netanyahu's indictment, he probably will be indicted formally. Mm-hmm. And you also said that 70% of Israelis think that that means he should resign. I don't think... 60%. Okay. I don't think I heard you say what happens after that. And let's say that Netanyahu is the next prime minister, and then he is indicted, and then what? If he resigns, does he resign? Who takes over? What happens?
First of all, I don't know. But put it this way, from my reading of what goes on in Likud, in inter-Likud dynamics, then it looks like the person best situated to claim leadership of Likud is Gideon Sa'ar. So now, what does that mean? Who knows? You know, I mean, some people say, "Oh, Gideon is actually more ideological than Netanyahu." So, you know, again, what does that mean? But as I said, I think that look, right now in Likud, naturally, because the Likud leadership beyond Netanyahu is under attack from those on the left side on the Netanyahu issue. So because they are under attack on the Netanyahu issue, for now, they are circling the wagon around Netanyahu. And you will not hear anything other than that until not only until April 9th, until there is an indictment. Do you want to wildly guess what's going to happen after the indictment? You know, it doesn't take wild imagination to know that the calculation completely changes once there is an indictment. Now, the reason I say in confidence because I heard the former commissioner of the police. I just happened to hear him in his voice intonation when he said a couple of months ago, when he said, I cannot, something like that. He said basically, I cannot conceive of a situation. I'm trying to translate from Hebrew. I cannot conceive in a situation in which this does not result in an indictment. And by the way, we have to remember that this has gone actually already farther than people thought, in the sense that it was not, two things were not clear for months and months and months. Number one, from everything that stinks, what's actually criminal, and from that's criminal, what can you tie the number one person to? Okay, now we have those two questions apparently are on the way to get to being resolved. But the reason why the statement that the police commissioner made goes further than that is because even if indicted, it wasn't clear whether the indictment will be on the lesser crime, which is essentially betrayal of public trust or bribery. Now remember that there was only one out of the many, many files that resulted in Olmert's going to jail that where the police had a case for bribery, okay? And when the former police commissioner says, I cannot conceive of a situation in which there won't be an indictment on bribery, boy, I mean, that completely changed the conversation. So I don't see how this is going to end differently. And if you want some to refer to the news of the last 72 hours, then there was also a development on that front. Because until the last 72 hours, Netanyahu was on this issue of which of the cases can you tie the number one person to, Netanyahu was not tied until the last 72 hours in any way to the submarines issue, okay?
Shai, thank you. We've worked you very, very hard. You've been brilliant, and all I can say is we'll have you back in June when the next elections take place. Thank you.
I got nailed when I said 3.5%.
I wasn't going to catch you up.
That won the debate.
Yeah, I actually have
Okay, tell some. I will. I'll find out the answer.
Thanks for having me.
Every time I ask him how we can help, I get no.
How you been? Good.
Oh, okay.
How are you? Good to see you, sir. Has there been so much good? I know, it's still.